Israeli thoughts on the issue?
No, but the policy concerning Israeli operations against Iran is divided itself. The U.S. policy concerning Israeli operations against Iranian proxies in Lebanon, in Syria, and in Iraq should be evaluated and analyzed separately. The U.S. government definitely doesn't want an escalation along the Israeli-Lebanese border for the sake that it will risk a further escalated conflict between the two sides along the border, which can risk Israel's national security, which can risk the U.S. assets in the region. But it doesn't stay there. In Syria, Israel has been operating in the regions that are not influenced by the U.S. and are under the influence of Russia. Basically, Israeli airstrikes in Syria occurred in the regions that are defended, in quote unquote, by Russian air defense systems and not by the U.S. But in Iraq, the entire airspace is defended by the U.S. So the question mark here is whether the U.S. granted permission to Israel to strike these the facilities of Iranian-backed militias. The most recent confirmed airstrike on a PMF facility in Salah ad-Din of Iraq, in Balad, happened in proximity of the Balad air base, where the U.S. forces are also stationed.
Right.
So it could easily kill U.S. servicemen in Iraq. It's not going to be too surprising to think that Israel has an open communications channel with the U.S. forces on the ground and providing a heads up to the U.S. forces to prevent U.S. casualties in these airstrikes. There were reports of airstrikes on the Ain al-Assad air base in Anbar. Couldn't be confirmed, but it's where the PMF, the Iraqi military, and the U.S. and the international coalition are all stationed. So technically it's not feasible for Israel to maneuver in the skies of Iraq and strike positions without a liaison with the U.S. government.
So in this case, we know that the Iraqis have kind of reacted to the attacks. The Iraqi Shiites have been most vocal about it, and the Iraqi government has also kind of responded in a way that's saying we will not tolerate attacks, and they are trying to kind of prevent certain attacks that happens on the Shiite militias, understandably. Do you see these kind of attacks in Iraq, particularly from Israel, to go on?
Yes.
And so the attacks going on, then speaking from the Iraqi government's perspective, what do you think the Iraqis can do to de-escalate and to avoid further attacks from Israel?
Well, they can buy Patriot air defense systems or S-400 from the Russians, which is not going to happen overnight.
Well, I meant diplomatically, not just like responding militarily. I think Iraq is not in a position to respond to Israeli military.
Military response is
null.
It's null. It's not going to happen. It's not possible to happen, really, with the advanced technologies that Israel is using, striking these positions. The only force that can stop Israel would be the U.S. in Iraq, and it's not going to happen because even though if the U.S. is not in support or in favor of these airstrikes, it can't really engage in a dogfight with Israel over it.
But also the strikes are kind of in line with U.S. policies, maximum pressure on Iran. If you want to increase the maximum pressure on Iran, you don't have to attack the militias, the Shiite militias. Someone else is doing it.
But that's Israeli perception.
So but that also, I'm saying from the U.S. perspective, you don't think that's the case where U.S. is green lighting these attacks? Like
U.S. has yet to make its mind regarding Hashd Al-Shaabi in Iraq. Some factions of this militia organization are definitely blacklisted in the U.S., but not all of them.
Right.
For instance, the most recent attacks, the airstrikes occurred on a facility used by by a blacklisted Shiite militia organization, but doesn't mean that it's still a violation of Iraq's sovereignty, which is a red line for the U.S. because the U.S. has invested a lot to strengthen the central Iraqi government. And the central Iraqi government was much stronger when the U.S. was present, ironically so, than after the U.S. left. But in terms of what Iraq can do is the ramifications of continued airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes on PMF facilities will be for the U.S. and not for Israel. There is a proposed resolution at the Iraqi parliament at the moment that requires the removal of foreign forces from this Iraqi soil, particularly focusing on the U.S. and the international coalition. And the proposal is in the hands of the Security Committee at the moment. It's pending a response from the Prime Minister's office to give them the locations of the U.S. forces so that the Parliament can pass a resolution requiring the exposure of foreign forces.
But there's always has been this demand or this desire to pass resolutions in the Iraqi Parliament to remove foreign troops. Is this one any different?
This one is much different because the PMF-led Shiite bloc within the Iraqi parliament is much stronger than previous times, and it was even some anonymous U.S. officials who spoke to international news outlets mentioned this, that this can lead to the removal of U.S. forces from Iraq by a resolution, as you mentioned. Israeli airstrikes have been degrading the military capabilities of Hashd Al-Shaabi, of Shiite militias, but have been strengthening them in the political arena. Because Israeli airstrikes are a validation of the anti-Western rhetoric of Hashd Al-Shaabi, of the Iranian axis. And this increases the pressure on the central Iraqi government to take diplomatic action. Importantly, the central Iraqi government did not mention Israel in any of its statements regarding the airstrikes. It condemned it. It announced that an investigation has been launched, and if there is any positive proof that a third party or an external actor is involved, it will take the case to the UN, but never mentioned Israel. Nouri al-Maliki mentioned it.
The former prime minister.
Yeah, the former prime minister. Another former prime minister, Hashd Al-Shaabi, mentioned it. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, the deputy chairman of PMF, mentioned it. But Falah al-Fayyad, the chairman of the PMF commission, who is basically the member of the National Security Council, refrained from mentioning Israel, and even had a dispute with his colleague, with his deputy, on the mention of Israel and the U.S. at the same time as the perpetrators of the airstrikes in Iraq.
So basically those who are in the government or holding official titles, they're not saying Israel,
exactly.
The ones that are
because
out.
it comes with responsibilities. I
Right.
mean, announcing Israel as the perpetrator of these airstrikes comes with a responsibility to take diplomatic action and and then respond in a way. Just like how Hezbollah did, it was compelled to retaliate, even though it caused, or not caused casualties, it declared victory because it had to declare victory for the sake of its own support base. The same thing happens in Iraq. But what we have seen in the past few weeks is an increased power of Hashd Al-Shaabi, of PMF, the Iranian-backed militias, over the government. I'll give you an example. For the first time, the KRG, the Kurdistan Regional Government, published a statement officially refuting that it has relations with Israel. The KRG leaders, Masoud Barzani, Jalal Talabani, and even others, had occasions mentioning that they had no relations with Israel, any secret relations, do not exist. But an official statement was, for the very first time, last week, the spokesperson of the Kurdistan Regional Government published a statement saying that there are no Israeli military bases in the Kurdistan region as claimed by some Shiite organizations. It shows that even the Kurdistan region, the KRG, has been forced to comment on what's happening in Iraq. So imagine the pressure on the central Iraqi government by the Shiite factions, how much they pressured them to take action. Therefore, the resolution in the Iraqi parliament today that requires the removal of foreign forces from the Iraqi soil is much more serious than previous ones, and it can definitely lead to ramifications for the U.S. forces. Right after the first round of partially confirmed airstrikes happened in Iran, Baghdad, last month, Prime Minister Adel Abdul Mahdi issued a memorandum and banned all unauthorized flights over Iraq, which included the U.S. and the international coalition flights. And the coalition had to issue a statement
complying with the
exactly, and it also shows how committed the coalition is to the sovereignty of the central Iraqi government, because what else would you do?
Right.
You know, it's a jungle, and you have to side with the most legitimate side of the most legitimate part of the partially functioning government. So a similar pressure can occur on the coalition to take further action in line with the central Iraqi government's stance. So I expect the airstrikes to continue, because it's a very clearly set policy by Israel that Iranian military capabilities in Iraq will be degraded. But I also think that these airstrikes are strengthening the rhetoric spearheaded by various Iranian-backed militia forces, increases the pressure on the central Iraqi government and KRG alike.
Allow me 1 minute. Let me remind our Kurdish viewers of the topic that we're discussing here. Bisaranu binarani Rudau lagal Ceng Sagnic, coordinatori دراساتی کوردی لسنتری کوردیناتوری پیشوی دراساتی کوردی لسنتری موشه دایان لتل-ئەویو باس لە ڕووداوەکانی ئەم دوایی نێوان ئیسرائیل و حیزب وڵای لوبنان هەروەها گرژەکانی نێوان ئێران و ئیسرائیل دەکەین لە نێویشیاندا ئەو هێرشانەی کە ئیسرائیل دەیکاتە سەر حەشدی شعبی لە عێراق لە ڕاستیە جەنگ ساگنیچ نزیکەی 6 مانگ بەر لە ئێستا لە نووسینێکیدا پێشبینیەوەی کردبوو کە ئیسرائیل هێرش بکاتە سەر ئەو گروپانەی کە لە عێراقدان و ئێستاش دەڵێت کە ئەو پێی وایە هێرشەکان بەردەوام دەبن زیاتر لەسەرم پرسە قسە دەکەین. جەنگ, so you do expect the strikes to go on in Iraq. In what ways can the strikes be decreased? I mean, what needs to be there for Israeli military to halt the attacks, or in what ways they can be exacerbated, in what ways they can be more strikes and more lethal strikes in Iraq?
Well, one needs to go back to the definition of the land bridge, the so-called land bridge, the Shiite crescent extending from Iran to Lebanon. It is not a matter of transportation of weaponry or ammunition from Iran to Lebanon or Syria, which can easily be done by air or by the sea. And Iran is doing it. They're not transferring tanks or heavy weaponry that needs to be transported by trains. The precision-guided missiles and other advanced technologies that Iran is spreading in the region to its own proxies and satellite organizations can go by air and by sea. But there's an insistence on creating this land bridge from Iran to Lebanon. The land bridge is about creating proxy organizations en route along this line. So it's creating commercial companies, creating allies, creating proxies, creating satellite organizations, if not proxies, to ensure a safe lifeline of supplies and ideology from Iran to Lebanon, to Israel, to the Palestinian territories, and to Syria.
So in another word you're saying is the land bridge is not just access to Lebanon from Iran, but it's a transformation of allegiances, of culture, of businesses along that route. So with the access, Iran can also have some safe passages or have cultural and ideological likings in the area where they can go even for the future. They can
exactly. Right. And Iran has been very flexible in creating these alliances en route to the Levant. It was very flexible to even to ally with some Kurdish organizations, with some Sunni organizations, even with Christian organizations, in areas that it was not able to create proxy organizations. It created satellite organizations. In areas it was not able to create satellite organizations, it created allied groups. But Israel is particularly focused on one aspect. That is not the ideological or the cultural or the commercial functions of this land bridge. It is about the long-range weaponry that Iran will be providing to Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iranian-backed militias in Syria. And the center of these operations are Iraq. It is because Iraq is a much better safe haven for Iran than Syria. The number of military bases belonging to Iranian-backed groups or Iran itself is way more in Iraq than in Syria, where the actual war is happening, has been happening since 2011, where we think that Iran has an expanded influence. Actually, the influence is much bigger in Iraq when it comes to the number of the militia forces, the size of the militia forces that are stationed in Iraq, the weapons stockpiles in across this country. So there is actually no way to stop Israel at this point. And I'd like to underline this, that this is not a political decision only. It is definitely a political decision, but it's also a product of years of studying the region by Israel's intelligence and military apparatuses. And it's not only the government or Prime Minister Netanyahu is deciding on these. It's very hard for anyone to stop Israel at this point from conducting these airstrikes. So what should be done is actually a very complicated question. Can one roll back the advances Iran has made in the past 7 or 8 years? Pretty much no. Can one convince Iran to drop its hostile stance to Israel? Even if Iran drops it, some other Shiite groups will pick it up and advance it. So it's very hard to stop Israel at this point. But it goes back to the functionality of the Iraqi government. What prompts Israeli airstrikes in Iraq is the expanded Iranian influence and the expansion of Iranian-backed militias. What creates this expansion in Iraq is actually the partial functionality of the central Iraqi government. Still not a failed state, of course, but it's a partially functioning state that is problematic, sometimes even more than failed states, because you have some sort of a faith in its abilities, but it cannot deliver it. So unless the central Iraqi government is strengthened again, unless the U.S. and the coalition and the Western powers give a helpful hand to the central Iraqi government to really take control of its own territories, which is only in control of the Green Zone in Baghdad, there's no way to stop Iran or Israel in Iraq. And contrary to Syria, there are no Russian air defense systems to protect the territories against Israeli airstrikes. Israel doesn't even need to engage in any diplomatic preparations before or after carrying out these airstrikes. It can simply do the airstrikes and go back because there's no air defense system in place to deter or intercept Israeli airstrikes. So it's a more complicated situation.
So what you're saying is, as long as the Shiite militias are not restrained in Iraq, Israel and Iran will see Iraqi soil as a playground where they can sort out their disputes, or they can Israel can strike the Iraqi groups, and Iran will, of course, try to further strengthen them.
Exactly.
But the other side of the question then becomes like, is the Iraqi Shiite militias, their control, that's not feasible either, because Iraq is in, majority are Shiites, and these groups, after defeating ISIS, or their role in fighting ISIS, they've been really emboldened. They feel entitled to ruling the country. They feel entitled to not only staying as they are, but they feel they're much more entitled to what they have now. So from your analysis, what I see is like the key to decreasing these attacks is to convince the Shiite groups that they need to be restrained, and that's not going to happen. And so this will continue.
Well, not particularly the Israeli airstrikes, maybe, because if, for instance, in the near future, Iran decides to remove its long-range ballistic missiles and other weaponry from Iraq for any purposes, Israel may temporarily cease the airstrikes on PMF facilities. But going back to what you said about how the PMF views Iraq is more problematic. But it's fair to say that even more Syria, Israel views Iraq as its Lebanon. It is the second Lebanon now. And it will remain as the second Lebanon, if not going beyond this. And if you compare the situations in Iraq and in Lebanon, with vis-a-vis the situation of the status of Hezbollah and Iranian-backed militias, you'll see a very weak central government and very strong militias who will want to rule the country, but not in an official capacity. The same is happening in Iraq. The militias want to rule the country, want to run the country, want to govern it, but not in an official capacity. They want to stay in their bases, they want to have their influence over the government, but they don't want to take the responsibility to really going into the parliament. They are in the parliament, but forming the new government and declaring Iran as Iraq as a country that is run in accordance with the Vilayat al-Faqih of Iran, or the ideological propositions of these groups. So it is actually a situation. It's not a situation of a coup that militias would take over the government and replace the apparatuses. It is a situation where the militias take advantage of a weak government, so they will keep it weak. And this is what will happen in Iraq. They will keep the central government weak so that the militia groups can operate with much more freedom. As long as this continues, Israel has been the pioneer in declaring Iraq not declaring, of course, but in viewing Iraq as the second Lebanon. But expect more Western states to join this camp and join Israel in dealing with Iraq as the second Lebanon of the Middle East, dealing with Iraq as the way they deal with the Lebanese government and the militias in Lebanon.
So, Cenk, since we're in Washington, let me come back to the U.S.-Iran relation as well, and of course the Israeli factor in this relationship here. Just a couple hours ago, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, in London in a think tank said that Iran is inching towards talks. President Trump already has said that he's open to talks with Rouhani in the General Assembly or in the UN meeting, and now Mark Esper is saying Iran is also trying to go that route. The question I'm trying to ask is the impact of these skirmishes between Israel, Hezbollah, between Israel and Hashd Al-Shaabi in Iraq, and also the tensions between Israel and Iran. Do they work in favor of U.S. trying to push Iran to negotiations, to talks? and restricting Iranian behaviors in the region, or do they actually harm what U.S. is trying to achieve with Iran?
Well, let's remember in May 2018, when the renewed sanctions were announced, correct me if I'm wrong with the date, were announced against Iran, the Iranian official stance was, we will never go back to the negotiations table. And now, apparently, as per the US government, Iran is inching towards at least some sort of a direct or indirect negotiations with the US. Definitely the pressure works. And we should not expect from Iran to say it out loud that it's under pressure from various sides. And definitely the Israeli airstrikes or Israeli attacks on Iranian proxies and satellite organizations in Lebanon, in Syria, and Iraq have been a factor, alarming the Iranian side that unless it has a renewed legitimacy with the US government, that can only be through the negotiations, Iran will be the target for Israel. And Israel is much more superior in its military capabilities than Iran, especially in those countries, because Iran doesn't have a strategy of producing advanced technologies. It's more about mass producing mid-level technology to consume and to be consumed by its proxies and satellites. But Israel is producing advanced technologies that Iran cannot compete with. Don't expect Iran to ever acknowledge this kind of a pressure has been working out and has compelled Iran to crawl back to the U.S. side, but definitely the military pressure is one side of it. And even though Israel may not have the green light for every airstrike it has been carrying out against Iranian-backed groups in Syria or in Iraq, Israel has a green light to increase pressure on Iran from the U.S. and from the current administration.
Ceng Sagnic, former coordinator of Kurdish studies at the Moshe Dayan Center in Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.